With media headlines always talking about the fear of an impending recession, high inflation, high interest rates, a crazy housing market, it is no surprise to me at all that the number one question that my clients are asking me right now is, should I wait to buy a home in 2023? Now, before we get started, let me start by saying that I think that this year will be full of opportunities regardless of whether or not you're going to be waiting to buy a home or if you want to jump into the market right now. However, I do think that it is important to understand your pros and cons and what your options are going to be if you decide to wait or if you decide to jump in. Now, if you're new here, my name's Kayton. I'm a loan officer from San Diego, California. And on this channel, I help people just like you learn how to make the home buying process a lot easier. And on this video, I'm going to be covering exactly why I think that the 2023 housing market will be the perfect time for home buyers, regardless if you want to wait to buy a home for rates to get lower or if you want to jump in right now. Now, to start, I think it's important to talk about the data points, especially the ones that I've been looking at that are telling me that there's going to be some interesting opportunities regardless of what you're trying to do. For starters, let's talk about the biggest thing that's been driving interest rates this whole time: inflation. Inflation was the biggest driver for high interest rates over the last 12 months. As inflation started rising pretty much out of control, interest rates started doing the same. And at first, it seemed that the Fed's actions were just a little bit too late, and inflation continued to rise while interest rates were rising too. And while the big tale of the 2022 housing market was inflation and higher interest rates, I think the 2023 is poised to be the exact opposite. Generally speaking, it looks like inflation has more or less peaked. We got as high as over 9% last year, which was a 40-year high. But now to start the year, the inflation report has come down all the way to 6.5%. Now, while that's nowhere near Jerome Powell's imaginary, but albeit really best-willed goal of 2% inflation, I think this is a big sign that shows that we've come off that big peak and now the economy is starting to recover. So much so that Goldman Sachs has actually started to believe that the United States economy can avoid a recession altogether. In a recent interview, Goldman Sachs mentioned that even though that they're keeping their prediction of a recession at about 35% in the next 12 months, they do believe that below average growth will probably end up bringing some sort of balance to the supply and labor markets. So essentially, this is a more cautiously optimistic view, believing that a recession won't be necessary really to tame inflation. So for better or for worse, it looks like Jerome Powell might be getting his soft landing for the economy after all. Speaking of the Fed, it looks like they're still poised to be relatively aggressive when it comes to interest rate hikes. And I think this is a good thing. I don't really see that there's any reason for the Fed to pivot and start lowering interest rates to stimulate the economy. So it'll be interesting to see that for the first time in the last 12 months, as the Fed continues to raise their interest rates, we might see mortgage rates actually fall instead of rising alongside them. So going back to the inflation data from the last 12 months, we see that once we get past May and June of this year, we'll be replacing those numbers with a lot lower inflation numbers. So it's not too crazy to think that we'll see inflation below 4% by the middle of this year. So as far as mortgage rates go, we're already starting to see a slow but steady drop of rates coming off of that high of 7% or higher. And now to start the year, we're as low as 6% for some conventional mortgages. So whereas Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac predict that mortgage rates will hit as low as 5.5% by the end of this year, my personal prediction is I think once we get inflation under 4%, we should see rates as low as 4.5% by the end of this year instead of 5.5%. So while the first half of this year will look a lot like the second half of last year, the second half of 2023 will be a much different market. So going back to the question at the beginning of this video, should you wait to buy a home in 2023? Now, it might sound crazy, but I might be one of the first real estate professionals actually saying that it's my opinion that it might make a lot of sense for you to wait to buy a home this year instead of rushing into the market. And here's why. Every 1% decrease in interest rates for a 30-year mortgage translates to about 11% extra buying power for you as a first-time homebuyer. Now, we've already seen interest rates drop from 6.5% to about 6% just to start the year alone. So if my prediction comes true and we'll see interest rates as low as 4.5% by the end of this year, that represents about 22% extra buying power for you. So to put that into numbers for you, if you were qualified to buy a $500,000 home at the beginning of this year, if rates drop basically by 2% by the end of this year, that means your buying power will have increased by over $100,000. Needless to say, that could be the difference between you settling for a townhouse and a condo to start and maybe getting into a nice starter home, a single family home instead. So that extra buying power that you're going to get is going to go a long way towards your budget and towards the kind of home that you could afford. The biggest downside though to waiting to buy a home in 2023 is realizing that pretty much everyone else is probably going to do the same. Now, while I don't expect a gigantic surge of buyer demand like we saw in 2020 and 2021 when rates hit the low twos, I will imagine that a lot of buyers who've been on the fence couldn't really stomach that 6 to 7% interest rate, but could afford to buy a home, might be entering the market at the same time as you. So my personal recommendation is you should wait to buy a home, but wait cautiously depending on what your financial goals are. Now, what if you're on the other side of the coin? What if you want to buy a home right now and you're actually qualified? Should you still wait for rates to get lower at the end of the year, or should you still buy a home right now? One of the biggest reasons to buy a home right now instead of waiting for interest rates to drop is the fact that, once again, pretty much everyone is waiting for interest rates to drop. So that means you still have little to no competition in the housing market. That being said, there's still not a ton of inventory on the market, but there's also not a lot of buyer demand. So you're starting to see homes still sit on the market for as long as 30 to 60 days, sometimes even longer if it's not well priced. So I think there's also still a huge opportunity for home buyers who are looking to buy a home before interest rates drop, and here's why. Recently, Redfin released their report for Q4 of 2022 and what that housing market looked like. And one of the big statistics that stood out to me is that 41.9% of home sellers gave a credit to the home buyers in the form of repairs or covering their closing costs, whether that's just part of their closing costs or paying for something like a rate buy down. Now, I've talked about the 2-1 buy down in this video right here, but I think this is one of the biggest opportunities if you are qualified to buy a home right now and you can jump into the market right away. And here's why. Even though mortgage rates are high right now, if you utilize something like a 2-1 buy down, you can get effectively as low as a 4% interest rate in your first year. Going back to what we talked about at the beginning of this video, rates should be hitting anywhere from 4.5 to 5.5 at least by the end of this year. So that presents a really unique opportunity for you to get into a house right now with little to no competition, have the seller cover some, if not all of your closing costs, including something like a 2-1 buy down. So you get to enjoy that lower interest rate from the get. So essentially you get to wait comfortably in your new home and wait for interest rates to catch up to where you're paying for right now because you use that 2-1 buy down. And then you get to refinance later on. Now, quick little asterisk here, you may not be able to qualify for the refinance when rates get lower for a couple of reasons. Of course, obviously you still have to qualify for the refinance, right? If something happens with your job, if you have a career change, if something happens with your credit, you may not be able to qualify automatically for a refinance just because rates are lower. But if you are in the position to refinance when rates do get lower, you'll be in that unique position where you've already got the home, you had basically no competition getting there, and you saved a ton of money in the process because the sellers paid for some, if not all, of your closing costs. Now, while this isn't exactly a super scientific data point, just looking back at the buyers that I've personally had at my company over the last 3 to 6 months, the average buyer in California had a closing cost credit of around $15,000 to $20,000, whether that was going to their closing costs, a rate buy down, or a combination of both. So really think about that opportunity for a second, right? If you can qualify, because you still have to qualify on the higher rate, but if you can qualify to buy a home right now, you're in a position where you can take your time with trying to find a home you want. You can qualify, but get a lower rate because of a 2-1 buy down, have the seller cover your closing costs, which saves you, tens of thousands of dollars out of pocket, and virtually no competition. You might even get a price reduction in the process. And you get all of that with the added benefit of knowing that rates are going to basically drop within the next year or two without you having to see that fully adjusted interest rate. So while yes, it isn't exactly ideal to buy a home right now because of the higher interest rates, there are ways that we could take advantage of this market to buy now and not have to really wait around for rates to drop. But looking at this practically, there's a lot of opportunity no matter which one you end up choosing to do. Personally, if you could afford to buy the home right now, you can qualify on the higher interest rate, but you got your down payment and you don't really have that much for closing costs, this is a perfect opportunity for you to jump in right now. Because like I mentioned, sellers are covering a lot of money in closing costs to help buyers get into their homes. And on the flip side, if you are planning on waiting to buy a home, this gives you a little bit of extra time, but make sure that you're using this time wisely and saving up not just for your down payment, but for your closing costs as well. If you are waiting to buy your home in the back half of 2023, expect a little bit stiffer competition that we've seen over the last 12 months. So while you may be getting a lower interest rate because of the market, you may not be getting things like closing costs or price reductions negotiated as well. You might even have to bid up a little bit because there's going to be a little bit more competition. Not as much as the last 2 years, but still a decent amount of competition to make it interesting. But whether you're going to buy right now or wait until the end of this year, I think if you choose to buy a home and it fits your financial goals to buy a home in 2023, you're going to find yourself with a lot more opportunity than we've seen in the last few years. Now, if you are thinking about buying a home in California specifically this year in 2023, I'm scheduling one-on-one consultations with my YouTube viewers to help you come up with a plan and figure out whether or not buying a home is going to make sense for you now or later on. It's completely free. There's no strings attached, but I just want to help you guys come up with a customized plan because personal finance is personal and everyone's situation is always a little bit different. So whether that's you or somebody you know who's trying to buy a home in 2023, I'd love to speak with you and help you get into a home and figure out what's going to make the most sense for you. Now, no matter where you're starting your home buying journey, the most important part of it all is to make sure that you're getting pre-approved for a home loan. So make sure you watch this video next where I cover all my best tips and tricks to help navigate you through the mortgage process and make sure that you're putting yourself in the best position to get approved for the home of your dreams this year. That's all I got for this one. Thank you again so much for watching. If you've got any questions, leave them in the comments down below. Hit that like button, smash subscribe, and I'll see you in this video next. See ya.